Greetings, dear viewer. Tell me if this describes you. You have heard about a book series called Percy Jackson and the Olympians, and you want to know if the series is for you. Maybe you have a friend who's a huge fan of this series and thinks that you might like it too. Maybe you've only heard of it in passing. Maybe you've heard of it because of the talks of the adaptation, such as the upcoming Disney Plus series, or maybe even the musical. Perhaps you've even heard of the Greater Connected Universe and you want to know what the recommended reading order is. Or maybe you're an existing fan who's just curious about what I think. Whatever the reason, welcome! This video will provide you with all the information you need to determine your ideal starting place and reading order for the various series. So let's start this off with the obvious question. What is Percy Jackson and the Olympians? Well, it's a young adult to middle grade urban fantasy book series written in the years 2005 to 2010 by American author Rick Riordan, who originally created the story for his son Haley as he was suffering in school due to having ADHD and dyslexia. But Rick was still able to motivate him by reading him stories from Greek mythology. After running out of stories to tell Haley, he asked his father to, and I quote, make one up. And make one up he did. Following the adventures of a sarcastic but lovable demigod named Percy Jackson as he navigates his relentlessly terrible life, fighting monsters from Greek myth, and oftentimes going on quests to save the world. Sound familiar? Well, yes, it is very much a part of the Harry Potter-like trend of YA books that came out around that time, though to be fair, it is a very good one of those. I've read a few other YA and middle grade series, and a few other series aimed at a younger audience, and this one still engages me much better than most of them. Even as I've gotten older, it still inspires passion within me, and I'm far from the only one. The fanbase alone should be proof of that. How many series start out with an awful adaptation and are brought back with a musical adaptation of all things, that is followed up by the fans shouting from the rooftops so loud that Disney itself listened and greenlit a streaming series? And, just to be clear, despite the comparison that I made, Rick is very much the opposite of J.K. Rowling in that he's a very kind man, accepting of criticism, and very supportive of the LGBTQ+ community, and very adamant about including representation of many types into his stories. From characters of various races, sexualities, and even gender identities in at least one case, but I'll get to that later. While the original series was concluded in 2010 with a fifth book, since then, Rick has written two sequel series called The Heroes of Olympus, which is about a much more ensemble cast of characters that just happens to include Percy, and The Trials of Apollo, which is about the Greek god of the sun when he is turned into a mortal and has to reclaim his position with help from Percy and his friends. There are also two spin-offs called The Kane Chronicles and Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard, which are about completely new casts of characters in hidden worlds of Egyptian and Norse myth respectively, both of which somehow coexist in the same world. That's a lot of books, and well, for the most part you can start with any of them, except perhaps the two sequel series, and just enjoy the story like any other. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to recommend two potential entry points, starting with the original series that is just called Percy Jackson and the Olympians. This series is not like Discworld or Cosmere or JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, where there is a big difference in quality from the first series compared to the later series. You can just read the books in the order that they were released in and enjoy it all the way through. As the name implies, this series is about Percy Jackson, a 12-year-old kid who has been kicked out of every school he has ever attended. Though, things start to change for him the day his math teacher turns into a fury and attacks him, and he accidentally kills it with a pen sword thing given to him by his Latin teacher. From there, mysterious magical things seemingly keep happening to Percy until eventually he's taken to a mysterious summer camp called Camp Half-Blood where he can supposedly get some answers. It turns out Percy is a demigod. His mother is a human, but his father is a Greek god. He just doesn't know which one. At first. Demigods in this world are born whenever one of the Greek gods falls in love with a human and usually immediately leaves before the child is born. As the kid grows up, they tend to struggle in school due to developing some form of ADHD and/or dyslexia due to their brains not being fully human. Remember when I said Rick originally made this story for his son who was struggling in school due to both of those conditions? Well, this is one way that manifests. Also, there are a lot of monsters from Greek myth present throughout the world. They are hidden from mortal eyes by disguises, shapeshifting, and the mist, a magical illusion that prevents normal humans and even demigods who don't know the truth from seeing anything from the mythological world. Also, demigods smell like McDonald's Happy Meals to said monsters, which is why they tend to die before reaching adulthood, if they learn the truth about their parentage. The main plot of the story consists of Percy being forced to go on quests across the country in order to save the world, usually by resolving infighting among the gods and preventing the Titan Lord Kronos from rising again and taking over. Joining him on these quests are a cast of colorful characters consisting of demigods and other mythological beings, each one with their own strong personality, unique character arc, and oftentimes tragic backstory, even worse than what Percy had to endure. Some were punished and or cursed as a result of angry gods looking for someone to take out their anger on, while others had an unstable family life and were forced to run away while being hunted by monsters if they can't find Camp Half-Blood. Most of the antagonists of this series are of course mythological monsters and titans, but most interestingly, some of them are other demigods. Plenty of them are understandably displeased with this grim status quo that treats them as nothing more than disposable monster fodder at worst, and dangerous quest fodder at best. So, when the Titans are rising up again, a fair number of demigods side with them in hopes of changing the status quo. One in particular has very personal ties with Percy and many of his friends. A cunning nemesis who has promised vengeance against the gods by Kronos himself. A charismatic leader who rallies an entire army against Percy and his friends. And someone who gets the better of Percy despite all of his power, time and time again. I won't spoil who that is because it's one of the best parts of the series, but if any of this has piqued your interest, great, though there are a few shortcomings I do feel obliged to mention. First of all, although I just praised Rick for representation, there isn't much, if any, in this series. That was something Rick would start throughout Kane Chronicles and Heroes of Olympus. And on the subject of LGBTQ+ representation, that was something he started late into Heroes of Olympus and slowly added more of in Magnus Chase and Trials of Apollo. That, and the series can be a bit formulaic in the beginning, with each book boiling down to a series of encounters until the climax happens and the heroes return home, as well as almost every character ending up in a romantic relationship without much justification. These are, again, both issues that Rick would improve upon with later series, most notably the last two. But even with those issues, this is still an adventure very much worth experiencing, and if you want to just stop there, that's totally fine. But if you want more and you don't care about the spin-offs, you can just immediately jump into the Heroes of Olympus and Trials of Apollo series when you're done with this one. But what if you don't want to commit to something that long? What if you want a shorter series to start with? Maybe you're looking for good representation, especially of the transgender community. Well, I'm personally going to recommend that you start with Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard. Now, I can already hear some of you existing fans asking, why not Kane Chronicles? Well, just hear me out. If you're specifically looking for a character of color protagonist, or you're especially interested in it because of the upcoming Netflix adaptation, or maybe you just really want a series about Egyptian mythology, Kane Chronicles might be what you're looking for. But speaking personally, it was my least favorite of the 5 series. It does have an interesting and well-developed magic system and world despite the shorter length, but I also felt it had the fewest number of interesting characters and the worst case of the forced romances I mentioned before. That isn't to say that I hated it. Far from it. I wouldn't call any of these series bad, and even my least favorite books in this entire connected universe I still really enjoyed. It's just that some are better than others. But back to Magnus Chase. Starring the cousin of one of the main characters from the original series, Magnus has lived on the streets for much of his life until his uncle shows up one day and asks him to retrieve a sword from an old boat wreckage. Only for a fire giant to show up and kill him once he has retrieved the sword. But it's okay, you see, he died in battle, so he gets to go to Valhalla, the best Norse afterlife, as an Einherji, one of Odin's immortal warriors preparing for the day when they all die in Ragnarok. The main plot of the series is Loki attempting to kickstart Ragnarok and by extension the end of the Norse pantheon. Each book has Magnus and friends working to thwart whatever scheme Loki is planning that week. Our heroes this time are a group of Einherji, a tag-along elf and dwarf, and the Valkyrie who brought Magnus to Valhalla in the first place. Because Valhalla is, the Norse afterlife, Magnus's floor mates come from all sorts of places and times. Each one gets the spotlight put on them for an arc of the story as they learn to work through shadows from their past, usually societal rejection, as most of them are considered wrong or a failure by the society that they were raised in for one reason or another. The cast consists of characters ranging from Thomas Jefferson Jr., a soldier from the American Civil War, to Hearthstone, a deaf elf who communicates through sign language and is capable of rune magic for reasons I won't spoil. Now, I promised trans representation in this series, so let's start with the most notable example. Alex Fierro, one of the later additions to the team, joining in the second book. Alex is gender fluid, and for bonus points, like Magnus, she was on the streets when she was brought to Valhalla due to being kicked out by a transphobic family. Quick clarification on why I'm using she/her pronouns. Alex is gender fluid, but she states pretty damn definitively in the second book that she does not use they/them pronouns, either exclusively he/him or she/her depending on the day. Though most of the time it's she/her, so that's what I'm using for this video. Alex is one of Rick's most popular characters, and he has come under a lot of fire for her inclusion specifically. And whenever he does, he usually blasts the transphobes back pretty hard. I mean, just look at this. In addition to Alex, we also have the shape-shifting and scheming Loki, who is one of my favorite parts of the series. If you're one of the people who was disappointed with MCU Loki when you found out that he was gender fluid, or sex fluid, and bisexual only for those aspects of his character not to be addressed in full, at least at the time of writing this, look no further than Rick's Loki. He is, in my humble opinion, the best antagonist Rick has ever come up with. Aside from that one antagonist in the first series that I didn't spoil, Loki constantly antagonizes the heroes through visions and curses, and he's such a skilled manipulator he's able to get them to do his job for him on occasion, all while he's imprisoned deep beneath Jotunheim. Even if you know exactly what he's planning, you still end up having to play his game. Now, I honestly don't have too many negatives on this series compared to the first series. Rick Riordan is one of the best examples I can think of when it comes to a writer accepting constructive criticism and evolving as an author with each iteration. That said, there are a couple of minor issues I can think of when it comes to this series. While the world is fleshed out enough and some of the characters get thorough explanations of their abilities, we really don't get to see what everyone else can do in terms of whatever magical abilities they possess, which left me with some unanswered questions. This wasn't a problem at all in Kane Chronicles, despite that series being of similar length, so I don't know what the issue was here. Also, the climax of the series was something I found a bit underwhelming. While I described the original series as flawed but still pretty awesome, at this point in his writing career, Rick had evolved and refined his writing style, and it shows, but I'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, so you've had your start. You're ready to dive into this universe headfirst and read every single book. Well, as I said before, you can just read the series in the order that they were written. Maybe interweaving the spin-off books in between big series in order to break up the binge and add some variety if you're so inclined. I mean, that's what I did, and not once did I get burned out. And that's despite the fact that all the stories feel very similar to a degree. Most of the main characters are teenagers who start out in very difficult lives who overcome hardships and build much better lives. That sounds formulaic, and to an extent it is. There isn't as much variety between the series here as there is in something like Discworld or Cosmere, though there is more than enough differentiation to make each of the stories and their respective main casts unique. Another aspect that I really enjoyed about reading all the series in order is how well it handles sequelization, something that for so many brands eventually leads to burnout on the part of fans and creatives, and or endless milking of fan passion until the story becomes creatively bankrupt and there isn't really a story anymore. This series completely rebuffs that idea. Every new story and character feels fresh, for the most part, and when an old character does show up, it feels like a natural part of the story and oftentimes a continuation of their personal arc, thus making the experience of reading all the books feel more like a well-crafted, cohesive, overarching narrative, kind of like the MCU, well, when it's at its best. On top of that, it's a phenomenal example of watching an author evolve his craft over time and try new things with each subsequent series. From multiple perspective characters, to more explored magic systems, to various types of representation. All of this culminates in one of the greatest, most cathartic reading experiences I've ever had. The Trials of Apollo. I honestly did not expect much from this series when I started reading it as the last leg of my Riordanverse book marathon, but it completely blew me away. It feels familiar because it's told in first person from one main character's perspective, and focuses on Greek myth primarily. And it's told episodically, with each book being a largely self-contained sequence of events and being set with some time between each of them. Kind of like the original series. But there is so much more to this series than that. I'm going to do my best to gush about this series as much as possible while avoiding spoilers. To start off, we have a very different protagonist than any of the other books. Unlike, well, literally every other protagonist in every other book in this universe, Apollo, or Lester Papadopoulos, isn't just another troubled teenager. I mean, he is in the body of a teenager, but in terms of his perspective on life and his life experiences in the narration, he's still very much a god. Just a god who is stripped of his powers and cast down to earth because of the events of Heroes of Olympus. He starts out seriously hating his circumstances and still retaining many of his arrogant and uncaring attitudes from his godhood, but he slowly grows more human. He starts to care about the people in his life, and he starts noticing just how horrible it can be to be mortal. He even has to confront his past head-on and reconcile with his mistakes in order to complete the quest, including the people that he's seriously mistreated. It's some of the best character work in the series, and in all the fantasy I've read for that matter. Not just great character growth, but great character redemption. We also have a secondary protagonist in Meg McCaffrey, with near equal presence throughout the story, and with her own extremely well-developed arc. She deals with parental abuse, and that's something that haunts her over the course of the story. It's not something she can just deal with once and forget about. She has a connection with the antagonists, and it's difficult for her to confront those issues during the quest, but it's something she recovers from and works to help others in a similar situation. The villains this time around are also some of the best villains Rick has ever come up with. The 3 Roman emperors are great manipulators, kind of like Loki, but they have much more presence than he did. Pretty much everything the heroes face in this story was directly caused by them. Their sphere of influence extends over the entire planet, and the level of preparation and forethought of their plans acts as a very challenging force for our heroes to overcome. And all that is without even considering just how well the series functions as a conclusion to everything that has happened thus far. Each book features a few characters from the previous 2 pentalogies in prominent roles in the quest, sometimes just showing us where they ended up, but other times giving us fantastic conclusions to their character arcs that started in the previous series. And that's really satisfying for someone who invested a lot of time into all the other books. Now, Rick has confirmed that he isn't done adding to this universe, but he also stated that this is the last big series that he'll write in it. And I'm okay with that, because it functions so well as a conclusion to this whole story, and I firmly believe that this series alone is a huge reason to read at least all the books in the 3 main series. The Trials of Apollo reaffirmed the Riordanverse as my favorite book series. While it's not the best, nor is it the most well-crafted story I've ever read, it's definitely a journey worth experiencing. Whether or not you agree with that, and whether or not you even enjoy these books, is completely up to you. Whatever your opinions, I hope I at least gave you an idea of why they mean so much to so many people. Thank you all so much for watching, and whether you're a diehard fan or a prospective potential newcomer, until next time, the Mythos Archives are always open.